rain barrel usually keeps dripping longer than the storm itself, even after the clouds have moved beyond the houses at the end of the street. Even after the thunder has become something distant and difficult to separate from traffic, the water continues falling one drop at a time into the barrel beside the garden shed. The grass below the feeder looks darker than it did an hour earlier. Small puddles gather in the uneven places near the fence. The feeder chains hold beads of water that catch what little sunlight has managed to return. For a while, nothing moves. The kitchen window remains slightly fogged around the edges where cool glass meets warm air inside. A mug of coffee sits beside the sink. Steam no longer rises from it. Somewhere farther down the street, a screen door closes. Then the first bird appears, not at the feeder, not on the fence, not in the wet grass beneath the maple tree. A small finch lands halfway up the old tree on a narrow branch extending toward the yard. The same branch. The bird settles, looks across the feeder, looks toward the fence, looks beyond the garden, and remains there, long enough to be noticed. Most people would probably never think about the branch. The storm is usually what gets remembered. The dark clouds arriving over the roofs, the sudden wind, the feeder swinging harder than usual, the sound of rain against the windows. The branch seems too ordinary to matter. It is not especially large. It is not the highest point in the tree. There are dozens of branches nearby, some thicker, some closer to shelter, some only a few feet away. Yet after enough afternoons spent near the kitchen window, another detail begins quietly repeating itself. The finch returns, and somehow it returns there, again and again and again. At first, the repetition feels accidental. Birds land everywhere, on fence posts, on tomato cages, on the clothesline, on the feeder roof, on the wheelbarrow handle left beside the shed. The yard offers no shortage of places to stop, which is why the branch seems unimportant until it doesn't. One afternoon becomes three become 10. A storm passes, the finch appears, the branch, another storm, the same thing. A different week, different clouds, different wind, the same branch. The bird is not always easy to identify. Finches rarely stay still for long, yet the location remains strangely consistent. The feeder chains tap softly together as the last wind fades. The bird waits, the branch holds. The rest of the yard slowly begins moving again, and before long, you stop wondering whether the finch will return. You begin wondering whether it will return there. The storms themselves develop familiar rhythms. The sky darkens, the feeder empties, the birds disappear. The curtains near the kitchen window move slightly whenever a draft slips through the room. Coffee cools. Rain arrives. Then the waiting begins. The strange thing about storms is how quickly a backyard can lose its ordinary sounds. A few minutes earlier, there might have been sparrows beneath the feeder, a chickadee moving through the shrubs, a robin calling from somewhere beyond the fence. Then gradually, there is less. The feeder sways empty. The branches stop receiving visitors. The yard seems larger somehow. Not because anything changed, because everything left. Birds rarely wait until conditions become uncomfortable. Most disappear long before people would think about going inside. The sky may still be bright. The rain may not have started, yet the yard has already grown quiet. Sometimes the feeder sits empty while the first thunder is still miles away. Sometimes the leaves remain completely still, and yet the birds have vanished. The absence becomes part of the routine. The empty feeder, the silent fence, the untouched seed tray, the mug beside the window, the waiting. Especially the waiting. Because once the pattern becomes familiar, storms stop ending when the rain stops. The ending comes later, when the first bird returns. And for reasons that remain difficult to explain, that first return often seems to involve the maple tree, the branch, The one halfway up, the one facing the yard. The rain fades. Water continues dripping from leaves. Droplets fall from the tomato cages one at a time. The feeder hangs motionless. Nothing happens. Then suddenly there is a small shape where moments earlier there was none. The finch, back again, not feeding, not singing, simply present, watching, as though confirming something. The branch offers a view of nearly everything. The feeder below, the fence line, the garden beds, the patch of grass beneath the maple, the narrow gate beside the shed. From inside the kitchen, it becomes difficult not to notice. The bird remains there only briefly some days, longer on others. But the pause itself feels important. The yard has been empty. Now it is not. The branch becomes the place where that change first appears. And because it happens often enough, expectation quietly takes over. A storm passes. The observer looks toward the branch. Not consciously, not immediately, just eventually. The way people glance toward a clock without realizing it, or check whether a porch light has turned on. The branch begins occupying a small corner of attention, even when it remains empty, especially when it remains empty. One afternoon, a storm arrives harder than usual. The wind bends the maple tree enough to make the feeder chains rattle continuously. Rain strikes the windows in uneven bursts. Water runs through the garden beds faster than the soil can absorb it. The wheelbarrow fills nearly to the rim. By evening, several limbs lie scattered across the lawn. Fresh leaves cover the grass. Small branches are everywhere. The next morning, boots cross wet ground. Broken limbs are dragged toward a pile near the fence. The yard looks different. Not dramatically, just enough. A gap has appeared in the canopy. Sunlight reaches places that were shaded before. The tree no longer looks exactly the same. And for a moment it seems possible that the pattern might finally end. After all, storms change things. Trees lose branches, birds adapt. The yard never remains perfectly fixed. The coffee beside the sink cools as usual. The feeder hangs still. The observer looks toward the maple. The branch remains, and shortly afterward, so does the finch, landing exactly where it always has, as though nothing happened, as though the storm rearranged everything except that. The branch now feels oddly familiar, not because it has become special, because it survived. The same way certain fence boards survive year after year while others are replaced. The same way a worn path appears through grass where people naturally walk. Repetition changes things, not physically, but in the way they are noticed. Before long, the branch becomes easier to find than the bird itself. The eye drifts there automatically. The observer looks for the branch first, then checks whether something occupies it. The routine quietly reverses. Summer eventually becomes autumn. The storms change. Rain arrives colder. Leaves gather beneath the tree. The feeder receives more visitors. Finches move through the yard in small groups. Some days the familiar bird becomes impossible to distinguish from the others. Yet after storms the pattern remains surprisingly recognizable. The branch, the pause, the return. The details surrounding it change. The routine does not. The back door opens. Someone refills the feeder. Seed dust falls onto damp wood. A dog barks somewhere beyond the neighboring houses. The branch waits. Another storm passes. The bird appears. The same sequence repeating itself so naturally that it almost disappears into the background. And perhaps that is what makes these patterns difficult to notice at first. Nothing dramatic announces them. No single moment demands attention. Instead, they gather slowly, one afternoon at a time, one storm at a time, one return at a time, until eventually the observer cannot remember when the pattern first began, only that it has become familiar. On dry days, the finch behaves differently. It visits the feeder, moves through shrubs, lands on fences, appears near the garden hose lying across the grass. Sometimes it vanishes for hours. The branch becomes only one perch among many, which makes the storms feel even stranger. Because the routine narrows, the yard offers countless choices. Yet after rain, the same location returns again and again. Perhaps it is shelter, perhaps visibility, perhaps simply familiarity. Birds often repeat what has worked before, not because they are stubborn, because certainty can be useful when conditions have just changed. After storms, everything looks slightly different. Leaves shift, branches bend, light changes. The yard feels rearranged, yet the branch remains known. The bird arrives, the branch answers, and the routine continues. Over time, something else begins changing. Not the bird, not the tree, the observer. Storms are no longer watched only for weather. Attention drifts elsewhere, toward the maple, toward the branch, toward the possibility of a small arrival. Rain begins tapping softly against the windows. The feeder empties. Thunder rolls somewhere beyond the neighborhood. And already part of the mind has skipped ahead. Toward later, toward after, toward the moment when the yard becomes still again. The mug appears beside the same window. The curtains move slightly. The feeder chains drip. The branch waits. The storm becomes only one part of a longer sequence. Sometimes the observer realizes this and laughs quietly, not because anything unusual has happened, because a small bird has somehow altered the way storms are experienced. A branch that once seemed invisible now feels impossible to ignore. An absence now feels like a stage of arrival. The routine reshapes attention, not dramatically, slowly, the way repeated footsteps wear a path through grass. Another season passes. The maple remains, the feeder remains, the kitchen window remains. Storms come and go, some stronger, some barely worth mentioning. The branch continues extending over the yard exactly as before, and every so often, after rain has finished falling, and water still hangs from the feeder chains, a small finch returns. Not always immediately. Sometimes several minutes pass, sometimes longer. The branch stays empty, the yard stays quiet. The observer waits. Then the familiar shape appears, landing lightly, settling, looking out across the wet grass. Nothing remarkable follows. No sudden discovery, no dramatic ending. The bird simply remains there for a moment, and somehow that feels sufficient. Because by now the branch carries its own history. Every previous storm seems to linger there. Every return, every quiet afternoon, every mug of coffee left cooling beside the sink, every curtain shifting in the draft, every feeder chain tapping softly after wind fades. The branch holds them all, without changing at all. Late one evening, another storm passes. The rain barrel drips beside the shed. Water falls steadily from the maple leaves. The feeder hangs empty. A screen door closes somewhere down the street. The yard settles into the familiar stillness that follows rain. The branch remains empty for a while, long enough to wonder, long enough to look twice. Then the finch appears, exactly where it has appeared before. The landing is so ordinary it would be easy to miss. A small movement, a slight bounce of wood, a quiet adjustment of feathers. Nothing more. The bird settles against the darkening sky. The feeder remains below. The grass remains wet. The coffee beside the window has long since gone cold. Around the yard, ordinary sounds slowly begin returning. A distant dog, a passing car, water dripping from leaves. The branch holds a single finch, and for reasons that are difficult to explain, the yard seems complete again. Have you ever noticed a bird in your yard returning to the exact same place so often that you started looking for that spot before you even looked for the bird itself?